Good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's Charlie Rossborough. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm finally back after being gone for 3 weeks for vacation. So I'm happy to be back, and I have an awesome live stream for you all today. So please join me. We're going to talk about a little bit of the history of the word queer. I know a lot of you are probably hearing the word queer a lot more recently. Some of you may not know where it's from or how it came to be more of an affirming term rather than a mean or derogatory term that it has been in the past. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the origin of the word queer. So it entered the English language in about 1513. It originally meant to mean things such as like strange or odd or peculiar. And sometimes it was even used to talk about things that were eccentric as well. Sometimes it might refer to something that was suspicious or, quote, not quite right, or to be a person with mild derangements or who exhibit socially inappropriate behavior. So these are some of the original definitions of this term. And so related meanings of queer included a feeling of unwellness or something that is questionable or suspicious. And over time, queer acquired a number of meanings related to sexuality and gender, which is what we see today. And it used to mean things that were very narrow, such as being just gay and lesbian, or then it shifted to those who were just not heterosexual at all. But it now refers to those who are either not heterosexual or not cisgender as well, or those who are just LGBTQ. Hello, Pan. Yes, I am back now. My vacation went by really quickly, but yes, I am back, and this is my first live stream back. So thanks for joining in. I'm talking about the history of the word queer, so you may know a lot about this. So some of the past uses of the word queer, it said in the Oxford English Dictionary, the noun queer was first used to mean homosexual by the Marquess of Queensberry in 1894. So that was the first time the word queer went from meaning strange or weird or odd to being associated with sexuality and gender. Further on, the concise new Partridge Dictionary of Slang, which I actually didn't know there was dictionaries of slang, says that the adjective queer began to mean homosexual in about 1914. So this is a relatively new um, term when it comes to gender and sexuality. And this slang word was mostly used in the United States. And it was noted that the term queer at that time was derogatory from the outside of the community, but actually not from within. So it actually hints that the term queer was actually a description for folks at that time, even 100 years ago. Even now, we see folks using the term queer to self-identify. Even if we go a little bit further into the 1950s, with the starting of the underground gay bar scene, uh, and then eventually moving into more openly gay bar scenes in the 60s and 70s, and even now we have gay bars everywhere. The homophile identity was gradually displaced by the radicalized term gay or the gay identity. And so at that time, the term gay itself was seen as the umbrella term. And so if you were a lesbian, if you were bisexual, if you were trans, if you were cross-dressing, you were just labeled gay. And that's why we have things such as like gay rights movement or the gay pride. The term gay was definitely used as the umbrella term at that time. You're self-claimed awesome. Actually, that reminds me, I like the word and use it myself. Much more umbrella. I agree. It definitely is a lot more umbrella for me as well. Here, I have a poll question actually that I'm going to publish. So the first question is, do you identify with the term queer? So we see that Pam already does. And folks who are joining in later can still vote on this poll to see if you do identify with the term queer, or if you don't, or if you do sometimes. I'm definitely a sometimes person. I don't personally hold on to the term queer for myself, but in certain situations, in certain contexts, I'll definitely use the term queer to identify myself. Um, just because I like the umbrella use of it, as well as just it's more mysterious. So if I tell someone I'm queer, they don't know um, what kind of queer I am. So yeah, so feel free to fill out that poll question. Ooh, my dogs are barking. All right, let's see. I'll keep the poll up a little bit more. So yeah, so after the gay term was used as the umbrella term, that term started changing to being the term queer, and that usually was applied to men who were believed to engage in receptive or passive anal and or oral sex with other men. Or to it was also placed on men who exhibited non-normative gender expressions, as well as some women, but it was majority of men that were called queer. Um, and stuff like that. And so that's kind of where the starts of the term queer kind of came in and uh, started taking that derogatory term. Let me just cancel that poll out. Awesome. So we have one person that says no. Um, and we have Pen that said yes. You can respond to a poll after a live. Cool. I have multiple terms used to describe myself, but queer is the most apt for relationship as a trans person. Yes, definitely. Oh, yeah, 50% yes, 50% no. Nice. Yes, you can. I'm pretty sure. I'm not sure if the new settings on live stream allow you to, but I know in the past you can still vote on live videos even after they've been recorded. And yes, no, that's a that's a great response, Pen. That people use multiple identities to refer to themselves. So for me, it depends on my situation, depends on who I'm talking to. Either I'll say I'm just male, or if I am comfortable with the group around me, I will explicitly say that I'm a trans man. If I'm in more of a, I was gonna say queer space, then I use more of the trans and or queer identity. And especially with when it comes to in regards to relationships as well as a trans person with my partner, I say we have a queer relationship even though both of us are straight, but our straight relationship is a lot more complicated than cis folks are. So I like to use the word queer because it makes me feel, I guess, more accepted in the fact that my straightness isn't fully straight. So yeah, so that's great. Thank you for sharing, Pan. So if we move on a few years later during the bar scene, the Webster's New World Dictionary, the college edition, because some of the younger editions didn't have the word queer in it because it was used for elementary school students, and even just secondary and high school students, they didn't want the word queer in there. And so this college edition listed queer as a noun and an adjective, and its definition was slang for homosexual. It stated it was just slang, not offensive slang, but just a slang word for someone who is a homosexual. And it wasn't until around that time that queer was used in mainstream society, and then up until the 20th century, along with other terms such as fairy or faggot, unfortunately. And so these terms were used against men who were perceived as very flamboyant. And this kind of goes back to my marriage live stream with First Timothy and how the Hebrew, or sorry, the Greek word for soft was then later translated to homosexual. It's this idea that men who are flamboyant or girly are obviously have to be gay or homosexual or doing any of those things, which we all know is not the case. We even see that the Dictionary of American Slang um, states that in the early 1990s, queer was adopted as a non pejorative designation by some homosexuals in the spirit of gay pride. And so this is kind of in the early 90s is where we start seeing that reclaiming of the word queer within our LGBTQ circles. And many state that this transformation began in the late 80s, early 90s, during the start of the gay rights movement, which was enacted due in part by the AIDS crisis at the time. And so some sources even trace the first adoption of the word queer as a positive self label to a queer group called Queer Nation, which was founded in the early 90s. And it was a radical organization that combated violence against homosexuals. And so they even state that co opting the word queer in their name was a way for them to disarm homophobes. And I think this is really true even now with folks like us using the word queer. It's a way of reclaiming and taking hold of the power that that word had over us for many, many years. And even further on in the early 2000s and so on, queer became increasingly used to describe more of the broader spectrums of non normative sexual and gender identities and politics. We even see in academia, there are academic disciplines such as, queer theory. That's in sociology. It's one of the theories that, or lenses, I guess, of theories that we view. There's also certain disciplines such as queer studies or women and gender studies. Queer studies is usually put into that, and it's even more broad because you can have queer studies within, English or history as well. And we see that there is other things such as queer arts, queer cultural groups, or queer political groups that are other examples of this modern expression of queer identities that have been growing and growing within the last 20 years. So, what is its current use now? So, queer right now is considered an umbrella term for sexual and gender minorities who are either not heterosexual or who are not cisgender. So, if you are someone who is straight and cis, queer is unfortunately not a word that you can use. It is only identity term for those who are not heterosexual or who are not cisgender. So if you're any one of those, like for me, I am not cisgender, but I am straight, I can still use the word queer because it is all encompassing. And vice versa, if you're straight and or if you're gay or lesbian, bi, pan, and you are cisgender, you can also still use this term. And for some, queer is a label adopted by only some people and is also still rejected by others. So it cannot be used fully yet to describe individuals or group of specific individuals unless that preference has been known. Because it can still sting, queer is acceptable for people in organizations that only use that term to identify themselves, and is not allowed to be used if it's intended to be a slur. So if you have a group that already uses the term queer within their groupings or their names, then that's totally okay. But if the group is LGBTQ, but doesn't specifically say queer in their name, or anything that they have, any of their policies, then that word is not allowed to be used to define or talk about for them. So for me, I definitely love using the word queer. So if you use that identifier for me, I'm totally okay with that. Um, and Pan, I am Pan. Yes, yes, you are Pan. Yeah, so queer is a really all-encompassing term, but there are still some criticisms when it comes to um, the term queer. So, for some, the reclamation and use of the term queer is not fully uncontroversial. There are several people in very different organizations who are both LGBTQ and non LGBTQ that object to this word for many different reasons. Some of the reasons are just the dislike of the term queer because of its political radicalism, because of where it came from, what it's used for. Some people just don't like how queer is used as a political tactic, because many of those folks who dislike it kind of feel like that the term and this radicalism within the community is the reason why there's such a divide within the LGBTQ community. So they kind of often see the word queer as being a direct role in this division within our community. Some other controversies about the role or the use of the word queers by some who just see themselves as normal. So if you're LGBTQ, there's many different sides to the community, and some of the community members are very adamant, very active. They're activists. They're out and open, educating, and so the word queer usually really jives with them a little bit more. But there's others in the community, especially in the trans community, who like to live stealth or just try to avoid anything that has to do with being very politically correct. And those folks who would rather live a very quiet and peaceful life, I guess, often don't use the word queer because of its radical reasons. And there are some other LGBTQ folks who just disapprove of using the word just because of its old use as an offensive and self-deprecating word, especially since the term queer is still used as a derogatory term. I personally haven't been called queer in a derogatory way at all. I've been called many other names, but queer hasn't been one of them. But unfortunately, queer is still used to this day, and so that is why some folks still do not identify with that term because of its use. Um, and some other folks just think it's, academic jargon or it's just slang. And some people really love this word and use it for everything. And I know I'm definitely one of those people. And yes, that's the reason we have division, language usage. Yes, I know. When I was researching that, I was like, "Are you sure? I don't know." I think queer is definitely a really interesting word. Um, Here, let me actually throw this last poll question in before we end, and I'd like to hear everyone's responses. So I'm going to publish it. The question is, do you use queer as an umbrella term? And so this is something that I would like to see if folks do. I know for me, I definitely do. So yes would be my main thing. I hope that within the next 5 years that the term queer becomes the new norm. I think it is a great word that is all encompassing, especially as someone who identifies as a straight trans person. Sometimes the term, gay pride or gay parade, sometimes I feel isolated and not included because of my straight identity. But then also, the word queer really makes me feel welcomed, especially since at the beginning of this live stream I mentioned how um, like within my relationships and within my own identity and my own livelihood, I don't feel like I'm some, cisgendered straight guy. Like my relationships, my life is a lot more complicated than that. And so that's why I prefer the word queer, just because it really emphasizes that I'm not just some straight guy. I have a lot more intersections of my sexuality and my gender that really impact how I see and live and experience the world. And so queer really does a great job at doing that for me. But at the same time, I do understand that for many folks, especially the older, I was going to say the older congregation, the older groups within our community who would have heard the term queer as a derogatory term all their life, I can definitely see why this is a term that they definitely do not identify with or want to associate with at all. So yeah, so it looks like we have 2 votes for yes. So I feel like a few of you do use the term queer. Is there any, I'd like to see in the comments, is there any situations or contexts in which you do and don't use queer? Um, that's another question I'd like to ask. So feel free if you haven't answered to throw that in the chat. Um, I know for me, when I am in, you know, if I'm in church settings, I love using the word queer. I think it's because it's a term that, especially within church folks, they often like to use the word homosexual. And so when I use the word queer, it really turns heads. It really gets people listening. Um, and it really makes them interested. They're like, wait, I've used this term as a youth. I've heard this term. It's a bad term. Why is this queer person, why is this LGBTQ person using this bad term? And then it really gets their attention. So that's why I like using it for that. And then obviously using the term for myself, that's where I use it. When I'm in LGBTQ settings, that's when my queer umbrella term kind of takes a back burner, and that's when I start using, LGBTQ2S plus, or just LGBTQ, or the queer, or the gender and sexuality, or I'll say like any other terms other than queer. And sometimes I'll just say, hey, I'm going to use the word queer as an encompassing term. And if people are offended by that or don't like that, to please let me know. So it all depends on where I'm at, and who I'm with and who my audience is. But for the most part, I do use queer. I think it is a great term. I think it is a great word. And so I'm really glad that you were all able to join me today and kind of learn a little bit more about its history of, being a word that just meant being strange or odd, and how it eventually, over time, became a derogatory term, but then was reclaimed almost immediately afterwards. Because that was one thing that I learned while studying and researching this, is that the reclamation of the reclaiming of the word queer is not a um, recent thing. It's actually been being reclaimed for many, many years. And so for me, I think it's kind of sad that it's been, what, 30 years at least, um, since the first example, I guess, of, an organization using the term for itself, that we still are pretty against the term. Um, but yeah, Britt says, yes, because there are some people who are still not ready to use it now as a term that has been reclaimed due to the past history of it being used as a derogatory term and still presently used in derogatory ways. Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's upsetting that we aren't able to use the word queer instead of, LGBTQ2S plus A, blah, 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 because I don't mind using it, but I know when I'm trying to teach, especially older folks, how to, learn the LGBTQ acronym. They often, the biggest question they ask is like, is there just a simpler term? Is there just like one word? And I always want to say queer, but I know that where we are now, we aren't at the time and place to use queer as that term, because of its history, because of its past, and how it's still pretty offensive to some folks. And so waiting until that time does come, and hopefully maybe another word will emerge and we'll use that instead. But yeah, I think it's a good balance of knowing when to use it for yourself and when to not use it when others are going to be maybe triggered by the term. So yeah. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Welcome to my new office. I moved, so you won't see my beautiful tapestry in the background. You'll just see my little photo of my dog. His name's Jackson. He's somewhere in the house. I don't know. So this is my new office. So you'll probably see me live streaming from here from now on until I can get back to the church. Um, but yeah, thanks for joining. Yeah, we got another response from Eric. For many older LGBTQ2S plus people, it was and remains a deeply offensive term and has not been reclaimed by them. Yeah, exactly. And so being mindful and respectful of that, I think, is really important when we, especially as young folks, are using the term widely. Um, and that's where I encourage you to use it for yourself if you wish, but to be mindful that there are a lot of folks who it still has deep roots in a lot of trauma and harm during their lives. So being respectful of that, I think, is really important. So thank you all for responding and sharing some of your own stories and some of your own reflections on the word queer. Um, so yeah, if you have any other responses or any stories you'd like to share about the term queer, please feel free to throw them in the comments. I will definitely take a look at those after. But it was great coming back. I'm happy to be back finally. So if you want to hit up and have a coffee, please send me a message. I am here all week. And I will see you next Monday for another Affirming Reflections. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.